Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it around me. Today, I wanted to touch on begonias, and specifically I want us to go through the different ways that you can propagate a begonia and the different ways that you can go about taking the propagate for the begonia. So if that's something that interests you, stick around and let's dive into it. Now, straight off the bat, I want to talk about the different media that you can use to propagate begonia in and some of the pros and cons of each. So starting off, and I've got quite a few propagates on the side here, and I'll pick one up and talk to it and we'll go through it that way. Right, taking up the first one, and arguably this is probably going to be the one that most people use quite comfortably. There is a good reason for this. So this is a Begonia brevirimosa subspecies exotica, and I'll bring it in a bit closer so you can have a look at that. And you might be able to see what this is being propagated in. So this is in Sphagnum moss. Now, with Sphagnum moss, there's a few things to consider here basically. So the thing that I will say with the Sphagnum moss, and I'll bring it up again, I was going to put it down, but I thought, you know what, let's just keep holding it. For once, I'm not holding particularly heavy plants, so it's great. With this method, I think it's probably one of the better ones, as long as you've got experience and you're comfortable propagating with Sphagnum moss. When I was first starting off, I really wasn't very good at propagating with Sphagnum moss because it's not something I'd ever done before, and there was very few videos on how to do it properly online. So I kind of stumbled my way around it and then found what I needed to do. In terms of Sphagnum moss, what I use is I'll buy the long fiber Sphagnum moss, and I can't remember now, I think it's spag moss, a long fiber Sphagnum moss. The good thing with Sphagnum moss is that it is reusable, so try to reuse it because I don't think it's the most environmentally friendly thing in the world. But as long as you reuse it as much as possible, then at least you're getting as much use as possible from something like that, basically. But what you want to do is you want to soak the dry Sphagnum moss in water, wring it out almost like you would a kitchen sponge. So it still needs to be damp to the touch, but the way that you would normally wring it out, you would imagine that there's not any water in there. There is, and that's just about enough for when you're first starting your begonia propagations out. The more mature they get and the more roots they have in there, you can have a bit more moisture within the Sphagnum moss. And actually, I will tell you something for free. This is in Sphagnum moss, which is sitting in a pool of water in one of my propagation bins. So this Sphagnum moss is constantly wet, but obviously there's a lot of air. That's another thing I want to say. When you're using Sphagnum moss, don't compress it too much. Leave as much air as you possibly can within the moss, and then you'll still get some of that air going towards the roots. Obviously, do not sit it in water when you're first rooting it out, especially when there's no roots there yet. But yeah, that's the big thing with this one. And this method works well for all the different types of how you can propagate. And by that, I mean whether or not you're cutting a stem, whether or not you're cutting a petiole, or whether or not you're cutting a leaf. And I'll come into all of those towards the end of the video. Let's talk about all the different methods first, and then we'll talk about how it's done. But yeah, Sphagnum moss, I'd say, is probably one of the most popular ones for a good reason. It propagates in it quite well, it roots in it quite well. The one negative that I will say about this is begonias generally will have very fine hair-like roots that can get intertwined with the Sphagnum moss really easily, which means then that by default, if you try to get most of the Sphagnum moss off before you move it into soil, you might be doing quite a bit of damage to the roots. On the flip side of that, if you then leave too much of the moss on the roots and then put it in the pot with the soil, the moss stays damp for quite a long time, so you might then also cause root rot. So that's why I'm saying the moss method, I think, is probably, at least in my experience, has been the best way that I found to grow it, and grow it fast as well. That's another thing. But it does have its challenges as well. That's why I'm saying, as long as you're comfortable with doing this, and I would always say don't start with your most expensive and rare begonia straight away into methods that you don't know how to propagate in. Start with some of your cheaper, more readily available ones, and if it works for them and you're comfortable with that, then move to your more expensive ones, because you avoid a bit of disappointment that way. But let me put this down and let's go on to the next type of propagation, and arguably the one that probably people have been using for years and without many problems, and that is propagating directly into a soil mix. And as you can see, this one's doing quite well. It still needs a while to kind of beef out a bit. The other begonia that you were just looking at, I've kind of left and forgotten in a propagation bin, and it had a leaf when I put it in there. It's now that big that it probably needs a janky support stick, and at some point I need to plant them out. But with my begonias in my propagation bins, because they're quite warm and they've got a high level of humidity, if I can avoid transplanting them out even into the conservatory that has got decent levels of humidity, now in the winter when it's a bit colder, I will avoid doing that, and I'll do it more in the spring and summer basically. So this is a labor of love over the winter and the autumn time to then bring out new plants essentially ready to be potted up in the spring and summer. But back to the soil mix. With soil propagation for begonias, at least, this is what has worked for me. And I know you don't need to do this, but I find a touch of rooting hormone goes a long way, specifically with this method. You don't have to. I know a lot of people propagate begonias directly into soil without any rooting hormone, and they do fine. I always, as with most of my plants, and I don't know whether or not you're supposed to do this with a begonia, granted I don't leave it quite as long as I do with my philodendrons and my anthuriums, when I make the cut, before I stick it in whatever medium I'm going to stick it, that's going to have moisture around it all the time, I let it callus over a bit. So usually with a monstera or a philodendron, I might let the cutting lay there in the air to dry up and callus over for a couple of hours. I might only do this for about half an hour just to get a bit of hardening around that stem. I don't want to dry it out too much, because the begonia that's been cut without any of its own roots can dry out relatively quickly, I think. So I don't like to let it dry out for too long. But in a soil mix, I would say make sure that it is very, very airy. So more perlite than you would normally put in there. You might need to water it a bit more frequently, but that's okay as long as it's not staying too damp for too long, basically. Because yes, begonias can be quite thirsty. Interesting little fact that I've learnt along the way with most of my begonias, because a lot of them almost treat them a bit like a calathea, so they always need to be evenly moist. Yes, they do like a lot more aeration than maybe a calathea might do in its soil, but I find it quite interesting because a lot of my begonias do like to go almost dry, so I try to keep them a bit like allocation. I'm looking at an allocation in front of me right now. So moisture meter again is my friend in this situation, and I will water them just when they're on the cusp between moist and dry. That's the kind of perfect thing. Any more frequent than that, you will probably run into some problems. But yeah, with all of the propagation methods that I'm talking about, give them a decent level of light, the same amount of light that you would normally give to your begonia wherever it might be sitting. I know some people say slightly lower light when you're first propagating and there's no roots. I've never done that. I've always given it the same level of light that the mother plant might get, and it's been fine, to be fair. So, but that's worked for me. It might not work for everybody. But yes, definitely make sure that it's a light and airy mix, and give it the same light levels. Make sure that it stays that moist before it goes towards dry, and you'll do fine with soil most times, to be fair. This is how people have been propagating for years. We're the ones that all got fancy with pon and perlite propagation and hydropropagation and all these things. This is how most plant nurseries have been doing it for decades. So they just take a cutting, stick it in some soil and move on, basically. But let me show you another method that a lot of people have used in the past. I haven't done it too much, so this is a bit of an experiment for me, because I find that this is the least reliable method, at least for me, which is directly in water. Now, I will say the ones that I've had good success with direct propagation within water for a begonia are the cane style style begonias and not the rhizomatous type of begonias, and ones that are usually on a stem and not the petiole directly into it. So the cane begonias, so I'm thinking the one that most people might be aware of would be the Begonia maculata whitei, which if I find a picture of my old one, because I have since gifted it away because that one was just getting ridiculously large and I had no space for it anymore, I'll put it here. But it's the one that's got like those angel wing looking wings with the white dots on them and the red backs. It's a very, very cool and unusual looking plant. So yeah, but those ones will do, those types of begonias that grow up like a cane. And I'm pretty sure the Bravura Mosa that I showed you, the pink one first, that is also a cane begonia. So that one would do quite well as well. But the rhizomatous are the ones that are a bit more low growing and the ones that bush out instead of up. So let's see how that goes. But yeah, water, as with most water propagations, there's not an awful lot I can say here. Just make sure that you change your water frequently so it doesn't go towards rot too quickly. And then you'll get nice kind of roots in there. The negative that you sometimes find with water propagations is you've then got water roots. Not as much of an issue if you're going to move it over to something like pon. Pretty sure begonias wouldn't do quite so well with leca. I am sure people who are leca fans will correct me down below, but I would imagine because of the large air spaces that it probably wouldn't work for begonias with the tiny roots. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I know pon does work because I have got some of my begonias growing directly in pon and they are loving life. But yeah, so just bear in mind you'll have water roots from water propagation, obviously. Pon will be fine because it will moving it into a similar kind of media. Sometimes I found when I was first doing water propagations for begonias and then I would move them onto soil, they would almost always lose most of those soils and have to regrow them in the soil. So then there's arguably a case of, do you just directly propagate into soil and cancel out the middle bit? So it's up to you essentially on what you want to do. Again, if you've had different experiences, do let me know. But I'll put this down and I'll show you the last method, which I've already kind of talked about briefly just now, which is using something like perlite or pon. Now, this is the Begonia tamaya, I think. And this was a lovely water propagated cutting. And this is an example of a cane begonia. So this is not a janky support stick. This is not a janky support stick. That is actually the stem of the begonia for a change. But those types of begonias do really well when you cut them and put them in water. They'll do okay in water. And this one was a water propagation from a very, very dear friend. And I think this was, I got this from her in the last local plant store, plant swap that I organized. So yeah, really, really cool. It's growing really well. I think there's only like 4 or 5 leaves and it's doing quite well. Moved it straight into pon because I knew that it had water roots and it has not skipped a beat. I've also propagated my Begonia amphioxus directly in pon. Done really, really well with that one. So, and actually that was one that I moved again from water into pon. So that tells you something. The good thing as well is that if they've been propagated in water and then you move them into pon, you can pretty much put them straight into self-watering pon and you're fine. But yeah, that's another way of propagating, which I'd have to say this is probably not the fastest. I think the fastest is definitely the Sphagnum moss. The most risky for me would be water, I would say. And yeah, I think that's a bit more on the different ways that you can propagate in terms of media. So let's talk about taking propagation cuttings. And I'll use the example of the Seismoria in water because the reality is that is a bit of a sacrificial leaf just to display today. I'm not going to be propagating that in water purely because I don't need any more Seismoria. My Seismoria propagation is, the leaves are almost to the Monstera leaf size at the moment. So that's the propagation that I did from a while ago. The mother plant is actually a bit smaller, but I've got 2 already. I don't need any more. So I'll use that as a bit of an example. But let me talk about the first way of how you can take a cutting to propagate for most begonias, and this works for the rhizomatous, so the ones that are low-lying, or even the cane begonias, the ones that grow upwards. So let me bring a trusty pair of, I was going to bring scissors up, but they are entirely covered in dust, so I might use trusty moisture meter. So you might be able to see there on the cane, what you would want to do is just cut slightly beneath the node. I would remove this leaf and make sure that you're maybe only leaving 1 to 2 leaves max, and I would say probably only the one. And the reason for that is essentially is if you've, and this applies to any propagation, by the way, for most plants, is if you've got a massive leaf and you've got a tiny little node, that node is going to spend all of its energy trying to keep that leaf alive in whatever media you've got rather than rooting down. So you want to have as little foliage as possible. You still need the foliage there in order for it to photosynthesize, but remember, you've kind of cut all of its root system off and you've left it with a leaf or half a leaf or 2 leaves. It's fine, it will survive, it will have enough energy for that little cutting that you've created. What obviously you don't want to do is have too many leaves, especially with something like begonias where they get quite large and ornate leaves. So a lot of my begonias, what I will do is, and I'll show you this on the Seismorii, what you would do, and this is the leaf itself with the petiole, is you would just cut all the way around there, discard the extra bit or keep it, and I will tell you why in a minute, and minimize the area of the leaf. And that will still help the plant photosynthesize, but it won't be taking all the energy to keep that leaf alive. Now, the stem propagation method that I showed you is the most surefire way of doing it. Now, the problem that you might get, and I'm looking at my Begonia melanobulata, which is the one with the little black spikes on the actual leaves. That one is finally getting to a size that's large enough now that I can propagate, but that is one growing stem. So, and the moment that you cut the stem, you're essentially cutting that growing tip. And yes, it will bush out, but I wanted to get a bit bigger first before I do that. So that is the only kind of thing to remember when you're doing a stem propagation method. But I find that more times than not, if you're doing a stem propagation, it will root and it will grow quite nicely, and it won't have too many issues with the rest of the plant. If anything, it will help it bush out because it will activate nodes further down within the stem. The other thing that you could do is essentially exactly what I've done here, is to take a cutting from the petiole. So the petiole is what attaches the leaf to the stem, and cut it there and stick the petiole directly into the soil. With this method, definitely remove some of the foliage, some of the actual material from the leaf, because again, you're leaving even less kind of area for the plant to grow roots in relation to the actual leaf size. So you definitely want to reduce this leaf size. I mean, this is large. I'll bring it up to my head so you can see quite how large that begonia leaf is, but you definitely want to be cutting it down a bit. Now, the other method, and I'm kind of going, in terms of methods, I'm going by fastest to root and grow to slowest. I'm doing it that way for a very specific reason, because you can do it in all these different ways. And the good thing about a begonia is you can get multiple propagations from the one cut that you might make, and I'll explain how. So obviously you can get a stem cutting, then you remove a leaf in order to leave only the one leaf on the other one. So you've got another thing that you can propagate here. You would then stick that in from the petiole straight into whatever growing media you've got. And then you can also go for leaf propagation in 2 different ways. So I'll show you now with a pair of scissors what you would do and what I was talking about. You would cut all the way around it, and you might be surprised at how much of the leaf I am cutting off. But essentially, hold on to this. That's how much you would need compared to how much the leaf was before. And that you would kind of put it in the media and it would grow. The other way that you can then do it is if you've got an issue with the petiole, you can just cut the leaf much closer to the petiole. And then what you would do is you would put this entire thing in the soil and you would bury it, so some of it would be showing up. and some of it will be under the soil or whatever growing media you've got, and then this little bit will root out. Or what you could also do is split this up into different sections, and I will see if I can cut this up so you can see. So same leaf, 2 different sections, because essentially what you'll then get is roots coming out from each one of these ribs, essentially this leaf ribs, or veins, essentially. I don't know what they're called off the top of my head now. I will remember there is a scientific name, and I don't know why I'm forgetting it right now. And you would stick this into the growing media. Let me put a few things down because I'm holding too many things. You would stick it into the soil like that. Make sure that the leaf is still slightly exposed on the top so it can photosynthesize, and it will root out. This is one that I find does benefit a bit by sticking it into some rooting hormone. And obviously you've got the different sections, and essentially if you really wanted to, each one of those nerves could become its own cutting. So obviously you're minimizing the amount of space where you can get that root growing from. But then remember this bit, and you could do this with a pair of scissors, or you could just rip, 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 rip. And all of these different sections, you would still put them in the soil in the same way. Just make sure that that root, that vein is touching the soil or whatever growing media it is. And the green part is obviously looking up so it can get the light. Maybe dust this with some growing hormone, and these could all end up with new plantlets. This, obviously being the last one that I'm showing you, is the slowest one, and I have been successful in propagating begonias this way. It took almost 1.5 years to get to the stage of 3 or 4 leaves, and it took a while. Everything else is a bit faster. Obviously the fastest one, as I said, is the stem propagation. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say about this. Have you guys done this? What have your experiences been? Do share down below. I'd love to know. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you guys here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great, great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.